Ellis Island. Ellis Island. Focus question. How was Ellis Island important to the history of immigration in the United States? Gateway to the United States. Today, much of the United States is made up of indigenous peoples, immigrants, and the descendants in immigrants and enslaved peoples. People who move from one country to another by choice are immigrants. Grants. For many years, immigrants to the United States had to pass through an immigration station before they were allowed into the country. Between 1892 and 1824, the immigration station that processed the most people into the country was Ellis Island, just outside New York City. Some experts estimate that almost half of all Americans can trace their family tree to include an ancestor who passed through Ellis Island. Between 1892 and 1854, workers on Ellis Island cleared more than 12 million immigrants for entry into the United States. Many immigrants stayed and ventured to other parts of the United States, such as the Midwest and the West. The immigrants of Ellis Island. Most immigrants who came through Ellis Island crossed the Atlantic Ocean on giant steamships. They came from many different countries, but most came from somewhere in Europe, starting in the late 1800s. Immigrants left countries such as Ireland, Italy, and Russia by the thousands. People had different reasons for leaving their home countries to make new lives in the United States. Some wanted adventure and a fresh start. Others fled hunger, violence, religious persecution, and other dangerous situations. Do you know? The first immigrant to pass through Ellis Island was a teenaged girl named Annie Moore. He left Ireland to move to the United States with her two younger brothers. Families of immigrants often arrived at Ellis Island together. Many immigrants traveled alone, though, because they could afford only one steamship ticket at a time. Often, the father of a family or a teenage son would travel to the United States first to find a job. Then he would send money back to home so family members could buy tickets. A ticket to cross the Atlantic Ocean in the late 1800s cost around $20 or $30. That is equal to between $550 and $900 in 2019. This amount was about half of what a worker from a country like Ireland might earn in a year at the time. Getting to Ellis Island. If they could afford tickets, immigrants still faced many challenges along their journey. Once arriving at their ship, they had to answer 29 questions about work experience, family they might have in the United States, and similar topics. The journey across the Atlantic was difficult for most immigrants. One boy's American dream. Osman Louis, a 13-year-old orphan from Belgium, snuck onto a ship at a stowaway in 1921. He arrived at Ellis Island sick and stayed in the hospital there. After hearing this story, a woman in the U.S. Army adopted him. Conditions aboard the giant steamships varied depending on how much money someone could afford to pay for a ticket. First and second class passengers enjoyed the private rooms and fresh air on deck. Third class passengers had to stay at the bottom of the ship in a large open room called the steerage. They had limited time to spend on the main deck. Hundreds of passengers together in close quarters caused the air in the lower decks to smell bad and carry disease. Many travelers became ill, which made a bad situation worse. After a difficult 2-week journey, immigrants finally reached Ellis Island. Since the steamships were so large, they couldn't dock directly at the island. After a brief health check and an interview aboard the ship, first and second class passengers disembarked and boarded smaller boats to enter the United States. Third class passengers, however, faced a series of checks and interviews on Ellis Island. Small ferry boats transported passengers from the ships to the island. Around 500 workers greeted the thousands of immigrants who arrived daily at Ellis Island. The process could be scary for many immigrants. They were terrified of being sent back to their home countries. Most Ellis Island workers were immigrants themselves and spoke the same languages as the new immigrants. Workers on Ellis Island had many different roles. Some workers asked the same 29 questions that immigrants had already answered on the ship. The answers needed to match. Workers also made sure that the immigrants could find work and a place to live in the United States. It was important to the U.S. government that immigrants not need government help to survive. The health check. Ellis Island workers also checked the health of the new arrivals. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and lack of medicine on the steamship all contributed to the spread of disease. Workers wanted to prevent immigrants from being illness into the United States. They were trained to notice signs of sickness, such as limping and fatigue. One of the most serious diseases was trachoma, which affected the eyes and could cause death. Doctors pulled back the eyelids of all arriving immigrants to check for the disease. One of Ellis Island's nicknames was the Island of Hope because most immigrants were allowed to enter the United States. The other nickname for Ellis Island, though, was the Island of Tears. Unfortunately, some immigrants were sent back to their home countries, most often if they had an illness that didn't improve. Families that traveled together had to make a difficult decision. Either they would all return home or they would separate from the sick person. Immigrants were rarely sent back to their home country. Out of the 12 million who came to Ellis Island, around 1% or 1,200,000 were refused entry. Children on Ellis Island. Sometimes children travel to Ellis Island alone. Other times they had to stay on the island for weeks while workers decided whether their parents could enter the United States. Ellis Island had a playground, a school, and places for children to sleep. Immigration slows down. Immigration to Ellis Island peaked in 1907. More than 1 million people arrived at its gates that year alone. People moved to the United States because its economy was booming. Immigrants needed jobs to build lives for themselves and their families. That year, many Jewish people fled attacks by the Russian government. Once World War I began in 1914, fewer immigrants came to Ellis Island. Overseas travel was dangerous and, at times, even impossible. New laws in the United States also affected immigration numbers. Some immigrants had to pass reading and writing tests or even solve a problem, which meant they had to learn English before ever arriving. Immigrants were exhausted and sometimes sick, which made taking tests more difficult. They often failed the test because they were nervous or misunderstood directions. The United States also passed laws to limit the number of immigrants from China. Then a 1924 law changed the way immigration to the United States worked while also banning immigrants from Asia altogether. Immigrants could apply from their home countries, which made Ellis Island and other immigration stations unnecessary. In the 1930s and 1940s, immigration numbers decreased. Ellis Island became a place where prisoners of war were held during World War II. 1939 to 1945. People who spoke out against the U.S. government and those suspected of being spies were among those held there. The Ellis Island Museum. As immigration numbers continued to drop, Ellis Island finally closed in 1954. People weren't arriving on large steamer ships anymore because of airplane travel. Many years of renovations followed, and the island reopened as a museum in 1990. Together, visitors can learn about the history of Ellis Island immigration to the United States. Descendants of immigrants can do research to find family members who passed through the station. While it may be a small piece of land, Ellis Island has played a large role in the history of the United States. Ellis Island was the first piece of United States soil on which millions of immigrants stepped. Those people went on to become Americans who worked hard to build better lives in their new country.